better. So, it's lovely to have you all here. Really nice to see you all. And for joining us for this satsang, the first in a series, this one. So, as some of you may know, we've been running these satsangs for over 5 years now. Although actually there's not many of the old regulars are here. A lot of new people this evening. Welcome to you all. And we've covered many different topics over that time. And more recently, I started up some study groups, the Tantric study groups, where we actually looked at some texts, ancient texts together. And now I've put that study group on hold just for the moment. I was finding that it would be really beneficial if we went back to the basics, really. The basics of philosophy, and in particular, Indian philosophy. So, I've already designed a course on the history of yoga, and hopefully I'll record an online version of that shortly. And I always intended to do a sequel that focuses more on the philosophy. Yeah, so this is not about the history of yoga. In fact, I've purposefully included no dates at all in these presentations. We're really focusing on the concepts, the philosophical side of things. So that's how this has come about. The intention is that it will become a course. So this series of satsangs, in a way, is a way for me to refine my material. So I hope you don't mind being guinea pigs in that regard. So philosophers very much like to define their terms, first of all. So that's what I'm going to do here. So first of all, what is philosophy? So this word is often used in a general, rather vague sense to denote the worldview or the ideological position of a particular person or a community. For example, you might hear somebody saying, I always look on the bright side of life. That's my philosophy. Or everything happens for a reason. That's my philosophy. So those are very nice sentiments and also possibly very nice outlooks upon life, but they don't really cut it as philosophy in a scholarly sense. In this more specific technical sense, this word denotes a particular type of mental activity, a form of practice, often described as something like the systematic and rigorous exercise of rationality. So the word, as some of you may know already, has Greek etymological roots, as do most of the terms in Western philosophy. Philosophia, usually translated as something like the love of wisdom. So we've had a look at the definition of philosophy. Now let's take a look at definitions of yoga. So there's many possible different ways we can use this word. The word yoga actually has a broad range of meanings. If you look in a Sanskrit dictionary, it has a very, very broad range of meanings. We're going to distinguish between a few possible uses of this term. So first of all, number one, we have yoga with a capital Y as a distinct school of Indian philosophy, or darshana. As we'll learn in a moment, darshana is the name for the different philosophical schools or traditions. And it's most often associated with the Yoga Sutras. Now, following scholarly convention, I will usually refer to this as classical yoga. This is yoga as philosophy, very much. And then we have another more general, again, a more general usage of this word yoga as this set of meditative practices shared amongst various spiritual traditions, such as Buddhism, Jainism, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, both in India and beyond. So all of these groups were practicing yoga. Buddhists were doing yoga, and the Jains were doing yoga. But notice when I use the word yoga here, I'm specifically mean kind of meditative, breathing, visualization practices, not so much the physical exercises, the postures, which came along later. And then finally, this third usage of the word yoga is yoga as a system of mostly physical exercise. Now, this is a relatively speaking modern development, but has roots in the Hatha Yoga tradition. Again, as I said, this is not a history course, so I'm not going into detail, but the postures first begin to appear in the historical record in about the 11th, 12th centuries, just a couple of them, and then they begin to proliferate over time. I will usually refer to this as modern postural yoga. So how much crossover do we see between these three usages of the term? Now, some yoga teachers at least do bring in some Patanjali, some philosophy into yoga classes, and that's really nice. But on the whole, I see quite a disconnect between that first usage of the word yoga and the third one. So much so that, in my mind, I often see them as two different things that happen to have the same name. But hopefully, through a course such as this, we'll be able to integrate those different usages of the word yoga a little bit more. So that's the beginning possible definitions of yoga. So philosophy in the East and the West. Now, India has, over time, historically, been largely excluded from the history of philosophy. Now, just an anecdotal case in point. When I did my undergraduate degree, the School of Philosophy at Leeds University, you could do an entire year-long module on a single Western philosopher, the philosophy of Kant or the philosophy of Hegel, for example. But the entire Eastern philosophy was all bunched into just one half-year-long module. Now, I suppose that's understandable that a Western institution would focus on Western philosophy, but I think it's a shame that there wasn't a more comprehensive and comparative study there. And moreover, this false dichotomy has emerged, which identified the West, in particular, ancient Greece, but also the Enlightenment, with rational thought, and the East with mysticism. We often used to see this contrast set up, and I think it persists to this day, actually. Not least in yoga circles. I often feel that sometimes the East is romanticized, exoticized. However, this dichotomy is clearly incorrect on both sides, because the work of Plato, for example, is filled with mystical ideas. You know, for example, he believed in reincarnation. Though these have been conveniently swept under the carpet by philosophers and others eager to emphasize the modern rationalist aspects of Plato's thought. And vice versa, ancient India was home to some of the sharpest, critical, and most rational philosophical debate that the world has seen. And this should become really apparent, I hope, in this course. Now, I really don't know when I'm screen sharing how to also see the chat box at the same time. Oh, there we are. No, there's nothing so far. Yeah. Okay. So moving on. Looking at basic philosophical terms. So straight off, somebody might object, well, aren't these Western terms? Well, yes, they are, to be truthful, but Eastern, as we will see, Eastern philosophy contained all of these ideas. Obviously, they didn't use these words, they used Sanskrit words. But the ideas and the same concepts are all there in some form. So this is like the philosophical terminology 101. So we have this word ontology. You may have heard of it before. What is the fundamental nature of reality? What is being? What is reality? Is everything one, a unity, or is everything a plurality made of lots of separate things? Is reality material, or is reality in essence mental, a product of consciousness? Now, these are just a few ideas. We'll be exploring ontology in more depth in the next session. The second term on our list is epistemology. So this is a word that philosophers like to use. When I was at uni and I told the folks back home that I was now studying epistemology, they were like, what? You're studying how to get pissed? Well, of course, you don't need to study that formally as a student. No, it's the study of knowledge, study of episteme, knowledge. How do we know anything? So how do we know? What are the valid means of knowledge? How do we know that we know? Can we know anything at all? You know, that's skepticism. Can we know anything? And again, there's a whole session devoted to that topic, which is a lot more interesting and fascinating, actually, than it can first sound. Next on our list, we have this term, phenomenology. And no, it's not the song from the Muppets. So this phenomenology is where we put aside questions of ontology, what exists. We put aside questions of what do we know, and we just attend to how we experience the world as human beings. What is the nature of conscious experience? How do we experience reality as human beings? So in the West, after a philosopher known as Immanuel Kant, philosophy took this phenomenological turn. People tended to stop asking the bigger metaphysical questions about what exists and things like that, and started to focus more on, what is it like to experience the world as through a human form. So the next word in our list is soteriology. Soteriology. So this is one that a little bit less well known. Again, all of these words, I believe, have Greek origins, but the word is normally used in theology. It literally means the study of salvation. But in the Indian context, it's all about how do we become liberated? The path to liberation. The big question for Indian philosophies. And if there is one distinguishing feature that separates Indian philosophy from most Western philosophy, at least modern Western philosophy, is that this ancient Indian philosophy is always orientated towards how to become liberated. It's not just philosophy for philosophy's sake, abstract theorizing. It's oriented towards how can we become awakened beings. So again, there'll be a whole session where we look at that. A few more terms for you. So we have this term realism. So this expresses the view that the world exists independently of the mind and our concepts and our words. So there's all different, there's all different degrees of realism. So at the very extremes, you have the view that the world is exactly as we think it is. And then we have more subtle forms. And then this is usually contrasted with its opposites, the concept of idealism, that reality is fundamentally mental. It's mentally constructed or otherwise immaterial. As we will see as we progress through this course, both of these views are expressed in different schools of Indian philosophy. So moving onwards, we have a look at these three related terms: pluralism, and that's the idea that reality is fundamentally composed of many different constituents, whatever those may be, the elements, for example, or atoms, for another example. Another view is the view of dualism, that reality is fundamentally composed of two constituents. Yeah, so we'll see again that all of these positions are held in different schools of Indian philosophy. And then finally, we have the view that's normally called monism, but in India, it's not, in Indian philosophy, it's not normally called non-dualism. And this is the idea that reality is ultimately just one thing, whatever name you may wish to give that one thing. And again, this is also, as we will see, a view held by some schools. Let me just have a look at the chat window. So now we're going to have a quick overview of the various philosophical schools of ancient India. This is just a primer because we'll be looking more in detail in later sessions, should you wish to join them. So Indian philosophy is often grouped into these various schools or darshanas. Now, darshana is a Sanskrit term that literally means sight, vision, or perspective. Now, traditionally, the term was used by doxographers. Wait, what's a doxographer? doxographers were basically people who just listed and categorized different philosophical views. So the term was used by them to refer to these various schools of thought in traditional Indian debating circles. So it's quite a nice expression to use. It expresses this idea that each school had a different view on reality. So these darshanas then, they're usually categorized into Vedic and non-Vedic schools. So sometimes these are classed respectively as the Astika or Gnostica schools. And this was in the older days, this was usually translated as orthodox and heterodox. But those two terms, of course, come from Christianity, and therefore they're not totally relevant to this situation. A better term is affirmer and non-affirmer. What were they affirming or not affirming? The Vedas. Those which affirm and those which disaffirm the authority of the Vedas. And the Vedas are the earliest strata of Indian scripture, the earliest surviving texts. So that doesn't mean that the Gnostica or non-affirming schools rejected the Vedas completely. They didn't do that necessarily. Rather that they just didn't think that they were the one and only authority. They had their own scriptures, usually. So we're going to look at the Vedic or Astika affirming schools first. And these are typically categorized into 6. So first we have the Vaisyshika, the school of atomism. So this school is one of the oldest schools of Indian philosophy. And it displays this interest in examining and classifying fundamental realities. So these Vaisishikas were in a way very much like modern day scientists, because they wanted to find out what the universe is really made up of. And they propounded an early version of atomic theory, believing that everything in reality is made up of these small indivisible things called, atoms. They didn't use the word atom, of course. They used an equivalent word. So their work can be seen as an early attempt to provide a comprehensive inventory of existence. They were realists, as we will see next time. Next, we have the Nyaya, the school of logic. So in my head, I kind of liken this school to the Vulcans in Star Trek. Just because they were mostly concerned with logic, with correct reasoning and the nature of knowledge itself. Questions of epistemology. How do we know what we know? What are the valid sources of knowledge? These are the kinds of questions that were asked in this school. And importantly, it was the Nyaya who first established the system of rules for conducting philosophical debate, which would be followed by all the other schools, including yoga, which we are coming to shortly, for centuries to come. So next we have a school called the Purva Mimamsa, or the school of prior exegesis. So this tradition is primarily concerned with a correct understanding of the Vedas, particularly Vedic ritual. And the preservation of that ritual was seen as vital to the maintenance of this cosmic order that's known as Dharma. So they believed that the Vedas were not of human origin, and that the language in which the hymns occur, that is Sanskrit, is sacred and transcendent. However, it may surprise you to learn that this school is usually classed as atheist. Now, how can that be? After all, we've just said that the Vedas were not of human origin, and the Vedas, after all, are full of deities, as you may know, Agni and Indra and the rest. But these deities, they're not creator gods. They're more like the gods of Greek mythology. Yeah, they're almost like superhumans. I tend to think of them as a bit like the Marvel superheroes of their day, in a way. But they weren't creator gods. So, and that's why, in philosophical terms, they're classed as atheists. And in fact, most of these ancient Indian schools are atheist in this sense. Yeah, a vast majority of them. So, next we have the Vedanta, which literally means the end of the Vedas, also known as the Uttara Mimamsa. So they're related to the previous school we just looked at, the later Exegesis school. So whereas that previous tradition dealt with ritual, the ritualistic aspects of the Vedas, the Karma Kanda, as it's known, this school, the Vedanta, is concerned with interpreting the more philosophical aspects, the Jnana Kanda. And in particular, that genre of texts known as the Upanishads. Now, the Upanishads, so I've already told you that the Vedas are the earliest texts in India, and the Upanishads are kind of the latest of those, the last of the Vedas to be composed. So there are various branches and sub-schools of Vedanta, but in the modern period, at least by far the most well-known is this non-dualist school that's known as Advaita Vedanta. That's how you pronounce it. The Va there is pronounced Wa, and the AI vowel in Sanskrit is pronounced I. So it's Advaita Vedanta. And this is associated with a famous philosopher known as Adi Shankara. So that's the most famous school of Vedanta by far these days, but all the evidence shows that back in the day, that wasn't the case. The other schools were just as, if not more, popular. So moving on, we have another school, the school of Sankhya. Sankhya. M with a dot underneath it represents a kind of a nasalized sound. So Sankhya. The school of enumeration. So this is a word that, depending on context, means to reckon, to count, enumerate, calculate, deliberate, or reason. So you're starting to get the idea of what this is all about. In the context of ancient Indian philosophies, then, Sankhya refers to the philosophical school based on systematic enumeration, rational examination. Sankhya is usually regarded as strongly dualist, regarding the universe as consisting of two realities, Purusha and Prakriti. That we'll be exploring next time. So Sankhya is important with regards to yoga philosophy because the school of yoga grew out of Sankhya philosophy. And indeed, there are some scholars who consider yoga as a sub-school of Sankhya. And of course, there's other scholars who disagree and believe that yoga is a completely separate school, but they are definitely related of that there's no doubt. So here we are, last but not least, we have the school of classical yoga. So this school is most commonly associated with a sage named Patanjali and the work known as the Yoga Sutras. All of these schools, by the way, had their own sutras. So there was the Nyaya Sutras, the Vedanta school had the Brahma Sutras. They all had a sutra text at the base of their tradition. However, Patanjali was not the inventor of yoga, and the Yoga Sutras are simply systematizing a tradition that is already attested to in all the text. For example, there's a section in the Mahabharata, an ancient Indian epic, that gives a very interesting pre-Patanjali overview of yoga. And earlier still, even in the Katha Upanishad, yoga is described, albeit very briefly. So, as well as being highly informed by Sankhya, which provides the metaphysical basis for the teachings, we'll explore this very thoroughly next time. The influence of Buddhism is also evident in the Yoga Sutras, interestingly. So we will, of course, be learning much more about the philosophy of this school in this course, the school which, of course, has become, along with Advaita Vedanta, perhaps, the most popular. Well, actually, obviously that's not true. Out of the Vedic schools, that is, Buddhism and Jainism come next. So now we're moving on to those Gnostica. But just before I do so, another quick look to see if there's any.
Go to more.
Yeah. We now look at the Gnostica schools, or the non-affirmer schools. So some of these are very early roots indeed, and these groups are known as the Shramanas. The Shramanas. Now this word Shramana means something like striver. What were they striving for? They were striving for freedom from suffering, for liberation. And these schools include Buddhism, Jainism, and lesser known schools such as the Ajivicas. And these traditions all developed extremely sophisticated philosophical systems, and they played an important part in the history of Indian thought. I'm not even going to delve into Buddhist philosophy today, but that in itself is a huge ocean of study. Of course, you can study an entire degree in Buddhist philosophy. We will just paddle in that ocean during this course. Just a quick look at the other two schools I mentioned there. The Ajivicas are interesting because they're known. The thing about the Ajivicas is that they died out, and all that we have left are fragments that exist in the works of later writers. So we can't be entirely sure what they believed, 100%, but this is what they seem to believe. In this doctrine of absolute determinism, in this premise that there is no free will, that everything that has happened and that will happen is entirely preordained and is a function of cosmic principles. The Ajivicas considered the karma doctrine, for example, as a fallacy. They did believe in rebirth, reincarnation, but they didn't believe that how we believed in this life would have any bearing on the next life that we would take. So that in itself is an interesting viewpoint, I believe. And there's still philosophers who argue this today. There's what is he? A cognitive neuroscientist, isn't he, originally? Yeah. And philosopher, I would say. Sam Harris, who you can listen to podcasts by him, and he is notorious, well known for arguing that there is no such thing as free will.
Very convincingly.
So next slide, we have Jainism. You may have heard of the Jains. They're still quite a sizable school, contributing so much to Indian philosophy that one can hardly sum it up in one paragraph or sentence. But its contributions to ethics are particularly noteworthy. For example, the emphasis on ahimsa, non-harming, really important foundational principle in yoga, of course, as well. And other ethical restraints, the Yamas and the Nianas. So I feel that sometimes the impression is given that Patanjali invented these, but he didn't. The Yamas and Niyamas had already been around for hundreds of years before Patanjali came along. The Buddhists had them, the Jains had them. The same, Jains had the very same 10, actually, listed by Patanjali. I'm not going to go into the 10 today. We will, another session on ethics will come along in due course. Also of note is their doctrine of Anekantavada, or many-sided reality. But this is very interesting. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the story of the room of wise men in a room with an elephant in it, and the wise men are blind or blindfolded, or anyway, they can't see the elephant. And each one of them touches a different part of the elephant, and from that, so one touches the tail, another touches the leg, another the trunk, the tusk, and based on that, each one concludes it's a completely different animal. So that parable comes from Jainism originally, so it would seem. And this encapsulates this doctrine of many-sided reality, that there's many different views on reality, and everybody's view contains some truth to it.
But there's only one reality. But we just can't see it because we've all got a different part of the elephant.
Well, I mean, that is interesting. Is there a reality that we just have different views upon? Or is there just different views and no reality?
Oh. Wow.
So anyway, that we can have an explore of that issue as well at some point. Very much this is just laying out the landscape in this session of what's to come. A more complex case is that of the various religious sects that emerged in India, such as Shaivism, followers of Shiva, and Vaishnavism, followers of Vishnu, and others, Shaktism, for example. And these tend to have both Astika, that is Vedic, and Gnostica, non-Vedic, usually, namely, Tantric strands. So this is the first time in this session we've encountered the word Tantric. As you know, this is an area of interest for me, an area of expertise on Tantric philosophy. It's a whole nother movement that emerged in India and spread beyond India.
So these schools are separate to the 6 that you've just done. We've moved on now.
Yeah, we've moved on from the 6, yeah. And what I'm trying to say is that they have both Vedic and they have Tantric elements too, in varying degrees, in different schools, different branches. I've done talks before on Tantra, and no doubt I will do more again, so I won't go into detail now. But there's some very highly sophisticated, non-dual Tantric philosophies emerged within Shaivism, which these days usually go by the name of Kashmir Shaivism. Wonderful school, which we will explore. Yes, of course. This is the last one, the last school. No overview of Indian philosophy could be complete without mention of the Charvakas, also sometimes called the Lokayatas. So the Charvakas were materialists. They held a form of materialism, and they completely denied the reality of concepts such as karma, rebirth, and soul. From the surviving fragments, again, we only have fragments of their work. All that exists is that which we can perceive with the senses. There must have been a sizable school of thought at one point, as they even they had had their own sutra text. But yes, only fragments are left behind. And they're usually stereotyped by their opponents as crude, atheistic, egoistic hedonists. But a close reading reveals that this is not the case. They're also often represented as being anti-Vedic. However, much work, so a scholar called Johannes Bronkhorst has done work on this area. And very convincingly, he shows that most, if not all, of these Charvakas were actually Brahmins. People who were born into and were initiated into the Vedic tradition, who were critical of these concepts. Cynical Brahmins, he actually uses that phrase. So I find this quite plausible, actually, because remember that a Brahmin is not something that you choose to be. It's not something that you convert to. It was a class, a caste that you're born into. So just in the same way that sometimes people are born into the aristocracy or critical of the aristocracy, it's unsurprising that there'd be Brahmins who are critical of these kind of concepts. And from the fragments that remain, it seems that they believe that concepts such as karma were actually used, to keep the masses under control. Do as we say, or else you'll be reborn as a worm. Anyway, that's their point of view, and we'll be exploring it. We've got a whole session on karma, which should be a nice juicy one. So that we move on to something slightly different now. Just checking who's still with us. So I just wanted to introduce you to these things called the pramanas, because these are important ingredients in Indian philosophy. And these are the means of knowledge. What are the valid ways of arriving at reliable knowledge? So when debating with another school, a Buddhist versus a yogi, for example, you could only use the brahmanas accepted by that school. So these are the various brahmanas. And this is the subject of the next session, so we're just preempting that, really. So, first of all, we have pratyaksa, or perception. So knowledge which is gained through the five senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell. Now the Ajivicas, of course, being materialists, considered this the only valid source of knowledge. Well, actually, this makes them even more materialist than modern day scientists, because even scientists rely upon inference and reasoning to come to a conclusion. But the Ajivicas would only believe what they could perceive with the senses, apparently. So next we have anumana, or inference is how we translate this in English. So this is where we reach a new conclusion and a truth from one or more observations and previous truths by applying reason. And this is accepted by most schools. And almost everybody will accept this. And as we go through these, by the way, I would like you to think about your own knowledge and how much you rely upon these different means. How much of your knowledge is based upon actual perception and experience? How much is based upon reasoning? So the classic example of inference in Indian philosophy is the following. There is smoke on that mountain. Where there is smoke, there's fire. Therefore, the mountain's on fire. So that's putting it very simplistically. There's actually five steps. So it's a little bit more complex than that. Moving on to the next means of knowledge, shabda, or testimony. So this means relying on word or the testimony of past or present reliable experts. Accepted by many schools. There's a, not by the Vaisyshika. And Buddhist schools, many Buddhist schools, they didn't completely reject testimony, but the Buddhists were very much about your own experience. The testimony, reading scriptures is listening to teachers is okay, but only if it accords with your own experience. So, again, think about your own knowledge, what you think you know, how much relies upon testimony, upon what experts say. So, an example, subatomic particles, we can't see them with our own eyes. Most of us aren't in a position where we can conduct experiments to infer their existence. So we very much rely upon the testimony of scientists, of experts in the field. Dare I say that viruses are another thing, hot topic at the moment. Can't see a virus with our own naked eyes. And again, we're relying upon expertise and testimony. And we're seeing a strange phenomenon currently, where there's this diminution of trust in experts. And that's been displayed in the current time. with regards to, you know, the virus and conspiracy theories more generally. Now, I accept testimony, and because I just find it very difficult to believe that a community of experts and scientists would go to such lengths to conspire against us and create such a thing that's not really happening. But anyway, that's leading us off track a little. But if you so wish, we can discuss it in the discussion period if anybody fancies to. So that's testimony. Yeah, relying upon when I say experts here, of course, I mean, you know, your teachers, your gurus, on scriptures that record the work of past teachers who've walked the path before you have. So, just one more, even though this one is not one of the big three. So this is upamana, or comparison, knowledge produced through the resemblance or similarity with some other already known object. So, anyway, I don't need to explore this in great detail because we will explore it in more detail next time we meet. And there are some further means of knowledge, but these are generally only accepted by the Vedanta and Mimamsa schools. So just a little bit more about the art of debate in ancient India. So philosophical debate was a highly sophisticated affair. You were expected to know your opponent's position really well, so well that you might even be able to write an entire treatise on that view. And that did happen. You know, we have followers of one philosophy who were able to write an entire text on a different school because they knew it so well. A formal debate involves two participants, the proponent, the purva pakshin, that is the one who holds the initial position, and a respondent, the prativadin. And then there'd be a witness or an arbiter, shaksin. This may be a distinguished individual, perhaps a respected authority within the community, or maybe even a king, or an assembly of some form. So the order and the procedure of the debate follows 8 basic steps, and these are nicely summarized, outlined in Richard King's book. Now, this is the time just to introduce you to this book. Probably not, because I'm probably just in a small box. Anyway, it's called Indian Philosophy, An Introduction to Hindu and Buddhist Thought by Richard King. And this is the first book that I got on Indian philosophy. And I've read it many times, some parts more than others. And if you were interested in following this course up with some further research, then this is the one. Well, I mean, no doubt there's other good ones out there, but this is a very good one. I can certainly say that. So here, anyway, I don't think I was umming and ahhing whether I'd go through through that in detail, but I think I'll leave it. If you want to see the 8 steps of the formal debate, you can find it in that book. Basically, it involves the proponents giving their initial position, and then the respondents either accepts or rejects it outright, or most likely they'll find faults, and then you're meant to kind of pull the expression is pulling the thorns, removing the thorns out of your argument to improve your argument. So there was very much an emphasis on coming to mutual understanding. So you weren't just shooting the opponent down straight away. You wanted them to argue as well as they could. So you helped them to do so, to come to some mutual understanding. So that's the way, in a very general sense, the debate went. So.
And those words that you went through before, they were part of the debate. Depending on what school you came from, you used it or you didn't use them.
Yes, that's right. Yes, those means of knowledge, as I did say, in debate, you could only use the means of knowledge that were accepted by because if you think about it, it makes sense. Because if you try and argue with somebody using things that they don't believe in, evidence that they don't believe in, you're never going to convince them, are you?
Yes.
So what they tried to do was to use their own logic
to convince them.
Against them, as it were, their own arguments. So I think we could learn quite a bit in current debates from this ancient system. So, relevance for our today. Why study all of this at all? So I found this quote I'm going to read out. It was I just searched really on the internet, and this is what came up. This quote. Have a listen, see if you agree with it or parts of it. Currently, our cultural dialogue is broken. By consequence, our society is slowly breaking down into a divide. Some of this stems from a broken education system, a broken mindset, and a broken way of thinking. We have forgotten the importance of philosophy, the importance of learning how to think. Philosophy is a foundational tool for understanding our world. If we don't provide a foundation of thinking to fall back on, then what are we really thinking about? So again, we can, if anybody feels like it, they can make their own contributions in the discussion. For my own part, I do agree that we do appear at least to be becoming more divided, at least in the UK and the US, maybe other places. And I do also believe that philosophy can help with this, and the art of reasoning and the art of debate can help with this. I take issue a little bit with this language of breaking down, because to break down kind of implies that something was fixed to begin with. But I don't know if there was ever a time where people really understood grasped the importance of philosophy. And don't forget that until recent times, I mean, the vast majority of the population did not have access to an education. And just on that matter, by the way, in ancient India, it's only really the educated elite who were doing all this philosophizing on the whole. So yeah, I just kind of question that language of broken. There's always this mindset, I think, that things were better in the past. I mean, even the ancient Greeks, for example, believed that there was a golden age, and that by the time that Plato, etc., had come along, humanity had degenerated. And the same in ancient India. You may have heard of the concept of the ages, the yugas, the Kali Yuga, that we're supposedly currently in, and that once things were more harmonious. So there's this constant, belief, a part of the human condition, perhaps, that things were better. But in terms of standards of living, at least, I think it can be questioned whether things are worse now than they were previously. Anyway, so that's possible relevance for today. Some of you might still be questioning, what relevance this has for yoga. And I would just say about that is that remember, where yoga came from. Remember that this classical school of yoga was, a darshana, a school of an Indian school of philosophy. So I do think it's very important to try and, as much as we can, bring some of this philosophical aspect of yoga back into the mix, as it were. So, future sessions. Just a glance at what's coming. Ontology. So the general movement of things here is from more general, more abstract, to more practical, specific things, perhaps. And you might wonder why that's the case, because you might want to get to the more practical things first. But I think it's important to really have a grasp of ontology, epistemology, really looking at what these schools believed reality was like, and how they believed we could know things, to really have an understanding of that before we move on to these other things. So the first two are sets. In fact, I've already prepared them. These next two, ontology and epistemology. The rest of them might not necessarily be in this order, but we will be looking at ethics. That's a whole branch of philosophy, ethics. How should we live? The lowdown on dualism and non-dualism. You're really getting an understanding of what those terms mean. What it means for yoga as well. What is the nature of consciousness? A very interesting one. We'll look at what all the different schools had to say about that matter. Again, a critical look at the concept of karma and rebirth. And then, quite possibly, other topics will emerge on the way. And that's the end of the slides. So I will now stop sharing the screen. Hello, everybody. So now it's time for some discussion. If anybody has anything that they would like to raise, or questions they would like to ask, or points they would like to raise. So at this point, feel free to unmute yourself. Do you want to be on screen? Okay. can, of course, also type in the chat window. Do you have any questions? Start people off.
Very early on in the presentation, when we were looking at you were talking about Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, and Western philosophy. Does Western philosophy include the Greek philosophers, or is it more a look at the more modern philosophies?
No, it obviously includes the Greek philosophy as the basis of Western philosophy. So if you're interested in joining the future sessions, then we actually begin each session by looking at what ancient Greek philosophy and Western philosophy had to say before we look at the Indian views, so that we can do a bit of comparative study.
Okay.
Which I think is very helpful. Well, I think it's helpful and interesting.
And then from that, I was thinking, so philosophies that weren't recorded, like more oral traditions, like Aboriginal people of Australia and shamanism, they're obviously not captured in either Eastern or Western philosophies. So how does that feed in, or does it not feed in to?
Sorry, I did a annoying thing where I looked at a question on there. I was thinking about the answer to that question and wasn't listening to you.
Okay, so oral cultures that had an oral tradition.
Yes.
So Australian Aboriginal, the Dreamtime, or shamanism, or North American Indians, or South American Indians, because a lot of the philosophical terms that you described, they also had belief systems, cosmologies, as well. So how will they be? Where do they fit? Because they don't fit under those categories, do they? Western or Eastern philosophy.
That's true, and admittedly, we won't specifically. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, you can't look at everything. For a very long time, they were just completely not even allowed into the philosophy club.
Yes,
it wasn't considered philosophy. But then again, for a long time, Indian thought wasn't accepted as philosophy as well, because people just hadn't yet properly discovered and understood it.
Because it's interesting, because a lot of their philosophies are non-dualistic, aren't they? Australian Dream.
Yes, it's a so kind of
they would
what we would call a materialistic monism or non-dualism, to use the jargon.
Okay, thank you.
So I've got a question here about the definition of the word tantric. Yeah, very good. So it's one of the most misunderstood words in Indian thought, really, I would say. So in the West, it's become, it's mostly associated, of course, with sex, tantric sex. In the tradition itself, I mean, some strands of the tantric tradition do involve sexual practices, some branches, but by and large, that wasn't the case. So Tantra was a movement that
do the literal translation of Tantra.
Well, a tantra was the name given to originally to the texts that were used by tantric practitioners. So their texts were called tantras. So like you had the Vedas, Tantricas had these things called tantras, generally speaking. So you do find this definition. So yeah, I mean, there is a literal translation of the word as to weave. Are you referring to that?
No.
Okay.
To what you were saying. And then also the word tantric, they didn't call themselves that, did they? They called them mantra.
That's right. The original name for the tradition was the mantra marga, or the path of mantra, which kind of shows how important mantras were in that tradition. So, where was I? So broadly speaking, it's a movement that emerged within about the earliest known texts come from about the 5th, 6th centuries of the Common Era. It may have roots earlier than that, but that's the earliest historical evidence. And it just brings about, a whole new way of practice, really. As I said, I've done other talks on the history of Tantra. Broadly speaking, there's two different branches, kind of what we call right-handed Tantra, which is the more conservative branch of the tradition, closer to the Vedic. And then we have the left-handed branch of the tradition, which is a bit more, what's the word?
I'm not a bit more rebellious.
Yeah.
Not following the status quo, really.
Yeah, transgressive in their practices. And whole new practices emerged. For example, mantras we've already mentioned. Mantras were used before Tantra, of course, but they took on a whole new importance in Tantra. The use of yantras. Some of you may know of yantras, those kind of symbolic, mystical diagrams.
See them in Buddhism when they do the sand one, and then they sweep the sand one away.
So it's a whole system of practice and philosophy.
Chakras come from there.
Yeah, the chakras originate within Tantra. It emerged in India to begin with, and then it spread outwards to Southeast Asia, even as far as China, Japan. So yeah, that's how I would answer. That's how I would answer that question. Again, it's a very broad tradition. I'm particular, from a philosophical point of view, I'm interested in Shaiva Tantra, non-dual Shaiva Tantra, associated with people like Abhinavagupta, for example. He was Abhinavagupta was one of the greatest of India's philosophers, perhaps one of the greatest thinkers, of all time, perhaps. His followers would say so, anyway.
Yeah, because some of the tantric practices as well, you could link back to prehistoric practices like shamanism. And
certainly certain aspects. Yeah. But for now, I think I'll leave that.
Yeah,
that there, just in case there's any other questions. And after the discussion and questions, I would also, for those who'd like to, we'll have a little chant. If chanting is not your cup of tea, then of course you can leave at that point. But I invite you, if you'd like, to join us. But first of all, any other questions? It's a good time to get people typing.
Yeah, that's right.
So, yeah, in general, I hope you got something from the session, and for those who are interested, you can continue and join our other sessions. I've already got the dates for the next 2, by the way.
Are the traditions oral or written or both?
So, the traditions in the very earliest times were oral, particularly I'm thinking here, the time of the Vedas, the time of the Upanishads, very much passed on from teacher to student through lineage. And then at a certain point, yes, people began to write, not in books, of course, but on little, I've completely gone out of my head what you call them, but like strips of papyrus or birch bark or some such material, began to write them down. So yeah, but of course the oral tradition would have continued as well. That would have carried on as well. And then yes, supplemented also by this flourishing written tradition. Ancient India, it's said that they've got their corpus of written material, ancient written material, is larger than any other culture, ancient culture. So huge amounts of writing, not just philosophy, of course. Everything from literature to, basically everything you can think of. Very good. Yeah, nice to hear. Nice to have you here. And of course, yes. If the question, what I find that happens with these talks when I watch other people doing talks is you think of a question perhaps afterwards. So if that's the case, you can send me an email or something. Right, so.
Thanks, Ben. It's been, yes, I thought I put the voice on, but very interesting. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Good to have you. Really good that you could make it.
And it worked well, the video and Zooming. Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay. And all the best to both of you. I'm pleased to see you're keeping well.
Nice to see you, Chris.
Yes.
How are you, Joe? All right. Bye then.
Bye, Chris. Take care.
Thank you very much.
So we'll have a bit of chanting now. So need to move that out of the way a little bit.
That's as far as it stretches.
Now, I'm guessing that everybody who's on this call, like a bit of chanting. But the thing I would say to anybody who feels uncomfortable chanting, and because you have the reference to various deities, I would just say it doesn't actually, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter whether you actually believe in the real existence of Ganesh or not. It's more great if you do, but it's more about the kind of the sentiment that's lying beneath Ganesh. And as many people know, one of those is providing an auspicious start to any undertaking, particularly a spiritual undertaking, and removal of any obstacles or hindrances that might hinder our progress on that path. So you can join in with that spirit. But I must say, it's been a while actually since I played the harmonium. So do bear with me if I make any
There's also
errors.
a time lag on Zoom, so there might be a bit of a time.
Yes, yeah, you have to be. I'm afraid you have to be muted, otherwise it sounds awful. So everybody has to be muted, and everybody.
We won't hear you.
Yeah.
Which is sad.
Yeah, but and anyway, in my experience, the sound of the harmonium doesn't sound good on the microphone. I've not tried it with this microphone, so
okay.
Who knows? It might be a bit better.
Sorry, but this is the best we can do as we can't have you here physically.
So this one is Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha Pahima, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha Rakshama, Om Gang Ganapataye Namaha. Yes, don't worry if you didn't get that in one go. We'll do it call and. Is there any point in doing it call and response?
Maybe do a few like that, and then everyone can join in.
Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Pahima. Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Pahima. Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Rakshama. Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Rakshama. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. All together. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha,
Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Lakshmana.
Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha.
Om Ganapataye Namaha. Om Ganapataye Namaha.
Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha,
Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Parima.
Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha,
Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Lakshmana.
Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha.
Om Ganapataye Namaha.
Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Parima.
Shri Ganesha, Shri
Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Jai Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha. Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha. Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Jai Ganesha.
Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Lakshmana.
Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha. Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha. Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Om
Ganapataye Namaha.
Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha. Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Slowly down. Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Lakshmana. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Jai Ganesha, Jai Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Shri Ganesha, Lakshmana. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. Om Ganganapataye Namaha. closing meditation, I just invite you to, if you're not already, just to sit up in that steady, comfortable, meditative posture. Many of the greatest philosophers of ancient India also happen to write really beautiful hymns, poetry as well. So it goes to show that it doesn't need to be either or. It doesn't need to be all abstract reasoning and the head type stuff, and it does all the devotional, heart-centered practice. It doesn't have to be just one or the other. Rather, we can blend the two together and incorporate both into a holistic practice. So, feeling once again that deep stillness and steadiness in the physical body. Being aware of the breath awareness, following each inhale, each exhale. Also being fully aware of those little momentary, natural pauses that lie in between each breath. Becoming aware of the mental, emotional layer of the body. What we might call the heart-mind. Now, one thing that we will discover about Indian thoughts in general is that there's not such this stark division between head and heart, thought and emotion that we often find in the West in modern times. Rather, the two, thoughts and emotions, heart, mind, are as one, integrated. And indeed, the word chitta can be accurately translated as heart-mind. And it's tuning into this mental, emotional layer. Placing your awareness, fixing your awareness at the heart space, Hridaya Akash. Now, deep core set the center, as it were, of your being. If you'd like to, you can visualize a flower there. It doesn't have to be a lotus flower. It can be any flower of your choosing. And nestled, encurled within the petals of that flower, placing a person or an animal, or maybe an entire country, or maybe the entire world or universe into that space. And we're going to send our 3 final healing Oms to your chosen person, place, etc. So, on the wave of the next breath, breathing deeply in here. And then, if you'd like to, if you wish to, you can practice palming. So the eyes are still closed, but you begin to rub the palms of the hands together, generating heat between the hands. And once you've generated that heat, you're cupping the hands over the eyes, the closed eyes. You slowly begin to reopen the eyes, receiving that warmth. And then perhaps gently massaging the face, the jaw, bringing yourself more fully back into the room that you're in. And then bring the hands together at the heart. Namaste.
Namaste.
Thank you very, very much for joining us for this session. If you'd like to continue and join the other free satsangs in this series, they are going to be a little bit more frequent than usual. There's one planned for October, one for November, and then breaking until January for the following one after that. So I can get the dates to you, should you wish to join in for more. You want to say anything?
Thank you everyone for joining. Wish you could all be with us in person.
Yeah.
But thanks.
Yeah, our satsangs did used to be in person, and we had a nice meal together. But for now,
at least we can
really
join this
feasible.
There are advantages because we do record it, whereas before we've never recorded any of the others. So there are advantages. So thanks so much. Really nice to meet all the new people. Nice to see old faces too. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Have a wonderful Sunday and a good week, everyone.
Yes. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Lots of love. Bye.